The village of St. Mary Mead had transformed itself into a postcard of Christmas sentiment. Garlands of holly and ivy twisted around lampposts, their berries gleaming like drops of blood against the winter grey. The market square, usually a modest gathering place for the village's modest affairs, now hosted the annual Christmas festival, a tradition that stretched back generations, when grandmothers had attended as children and their grandmothers before them. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the square, a small woman of indeterminate age, dressed in dove grey with a handkerchief tucked into her sleeve. Her eyes, pale blue and perpetually observant, took in the scene with the quiet attention of someone who had spent 70-some years watching people. A woolen scarf, knitted by her own hands in a pattern of delicate snowflakes, was wrapped twice around her neck. "Such a lovely turnout this year," remarked Mrs. Protheroe, positioning herself beside Miss Marple, with the determination of ivy claiming a garden wall. She clutched a paper cup of mulled wine, steam rising from it in fragrant spirals. Though I must say, the decorating committee could have done better with the angel. Miss Marple glanced toward the focal point of the festival, a towering framework of wood and plaster, upon which sat an angel figure, approximately 8 feet tall, with outstretched wings painted gold and a serene expression of beatific peace. It was indeed rather grand for St. Mary Mead, a village where ostentation was viewed with the same suspicion one might reserve for unexplained stains on a carpet. "It was Lord Ashford's donation, I understand," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes, well," Mrs. Protheroe lowered her voice, an art form she had perfected over decades of village life. "One wonders where he found the money. His estate has been struggling for years. My cousin's friend's nephew works in the bank, you understand, and apparently—" But Miss Marple's attention had shifted. It often did in these village conversations, drifting toward details others overlooked. She watched as a young woman in a red coat moved through the crowd, her movements quick and anxious. Behind her, at a careful distance, came a man in a dark overcoat, his face a study in controlled anger. And there, near the refreshment table, stood Reverend Thurston, the village vicar, speaking with Lord Ashford himself. The Reverend's usually composed features bore attention that suggested the conversation was not about carols or hymn selections. "Said he was merely protecting the family's interests," Mrs. Protheroe continued, either unaware of or indifferent to Miss Marple's distraction. "But I ask you, how does a man protect interests that he doesn't have? His daughter was quite the scandal, you know. The one who ran off to London with that dreadful musician. Never did come back to the village, though I heard she'd—" "Miss Marple!" A young voice interrupted them. It was Timothy Fletcher, the vicar's nephew, a lanky boy of 15 with the energy of a Springer Spaniel. "You simply must see the lights they've rigged up on the Angel. When it gets dark, which will be soon, the days are hardly worth mentioning now, the whole thing lights up. Rather like something from a film, I thought." "How delightful," Miss Marple said, and meant it. She had always found Christmas, despite its commercialism and forced cheer, to be a time when people's true natures became more visible. The pressure to appear festive, to maintain the fiction of a happy household, often cracked under sustained observation. The afternoon progressed as such afternoons do in English villages. The Christmas Fair Committee chairman, a breathlessly enthusiastic woman named Phyllis Underwood, opened the festivities with remarks about tradition and community. There were carol singers, their voices wavering between key and uncertainty. There were stalls selling homemade preserves and handicrafts, where the real community news was exchanged in whispers over jars of chutney. There was hot cider and mince pies and the particular British chaos of attempting to enjoy winter weather while maintaining dignity. Miss Marple moved through it all with the gentle persistence of a woman who has nothing more pressing to do, which was partly true, though her mind was never truly idle. She purchased a knitted scarf from the Women's Institute stall, a gesture of community support, and chatted with various villagers, absorbing the small details that made up the texture of their lives. It was around 4 o'clock, when the winter darkness was already creeping in, and the first of the Angel's new electric lights were being tested, that the evening took its turn toward disaster. The lights on the Angel came on suddenly, a blaze of white bulbs that made the figure seem to glow from within. It was indeed theatrical, Miss Marple thought, and rather beautiful in its way. The crowd oohed appreciatively. Several people raised their cameras. "Remarkable engineering, really," said Mr. Bantham, who managed the hardware store and considered himself something of a practical expert. "They've run the wiring through the base there and then up along the—" The Angel began to move. At first it was barely perceptible, a slight shifting as if it were settling. Then the movement became more pronounced. The figure, which had been perfectly upright, began to tilt forward. The serene expression on its plaster face seemed to transform into something more sinister as it angled toward the crowd below. Someone screamed. The crowd surged backward, a collective gasp of panic. The Angel descended like a felled tree, its golden wings spread as if in farewell, and landed with tremendous force directly on the spot where Lord Ashford had been standing moments before. The silence that followed was profound, and beneath the Angel, visible only to those who moved close enough to see clearly, was Lord Ashford himself, pinned beneath several £100 of plaster and wood, very obviously and very permanently dead. It was Miss Marple who noticed, as the village constable knelt in shocked disbelief, that the Angel's mechanism, the system that should have held it firmly in place, had been deliberately tampered with. The support rod had been partially severed, sanded down to a dangerous thinness that would fail under the slightest additional weight. But she said nothing. Not yet. In Miss Marple's experience, the first moments after a crime were often when people revealed the most. And she had already begun to notice certain things, the way the young woman in the red coat had gone very pale, the careful distance maintained by the man in the dark overcoat, the particular expression on Reverend Thurston's face. Not shock, but something closer to grim confirmation. The Christmas festival had come to an abrupt and violent end. And Miss Marple, settling herself on a nearby bench as chaos unfolded around her, began the work she did best. She began to observe. By evening, the news had spread through St. Mary Mead with the velocity of spilled ink across white cloth. Lord Ashford was dead, murdered most certainly, though the authorities were still going through the motions of calling it an accident. The angel's sabotage was evident enough to anyone with functioning eyes, and in a village where secrets were the primary currency of social exchange, such obvious evidence of foul play became the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. The Red Lion public house was packed by 7 o'clock. Constable Pettigrew, a man of moderate competence and considerable frustration, had cordoned off the market square with rope and posted a notice requesting that no one disturb the scene pending the arrival of inspectors from the county. This had the inevitable effect of making the angel and its victim the most interesting thing that had happened to St. Mary Mead in a decade. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room with a cup of Earl Grey, listening to her neighbour Mrs. Banfield, who had somehow materialized at her door with the news, or rather with approximately 17 different versions of the news, each more elaborate than the last. "They're saying it was deliberately done," Mrs. Banfield whispered, perched on the edge of the wing-back chair, as though afraid it might bite her. She was a thin woman, with the kind of face that seemed designed to convey perpetual anxiety. "I heard from Margaret, you know, the butcher's wife, that the police found marks on the metal. Deliberate marks." "How dreadful," Miss Marple murmured, setting down her teacup with careful precision. "And that's not all," Mrs. Banfield continued, clearly having saved the best for the middle. "Lord Ashford had been in quite a state these past weeks, apparently, and this is from Patricia Thornton, who heard it from her sister, who does the cleaning at the hall. He'd been having terrible rows with his son." Miss Marple made a small noise that could be interpreted as surprise or interest depending on the listener's inclination. "The son, Malcolm, you know, the one who works in London, he came home unexpectedly last month. Patricia said there were raised voices, doors slamming." Mrs. Banfield paused to take a breath, which she clearly needed. Miss Marple prompted, though she suspected she knew exactly which woman Mrs. Banfield meant. "Elena, that's her name, a foreigner, Miss Marple. Polish or Hungarian or something Eastern European. She came to work at the hall about 8 months ago, as some sort of companion to Lady Ashford." Miss Marple had observed Elena herself at the festival, the young woman in the red coat whose anxiety had been visible enough to read like newsprint. She had also observed the way Lord Ashford's gaze had followed the girl, not with the harmless appreciation of an older man for youthful beauty, but with something considerably more possessive. "Triangles," Mrs. Banfield said darkly, as though the word explained everything. "Always triangles, Miss Marple. That's what my mother used to say." After Mrs. Banfield left, reluctantly, as though she feared Miss Marple might somehow discover additional gossip in her absence, Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair with her knitting. The needles clicked in a steady rhythm as she worked on a particularly complex Fair Isle pattern. The repetitive motion was soothing, and it freed her mind to think. She had seen the man in the dark overcoat clearly now, in the chaos following the angel's collapse. She had heard his name whispered among the crowd. David Garrett, Lord Ashford's nephew, the son of the Ashfords' late daughter, the one who had scandalously run away to London years ago. He had returned to the village only recently, staying at the boarding house, keeping himself separate from the village's social machinery. And there was the matter of Reverend Thurston's conversation with Lord Ashford before the angel had fallen. The Reverend's expression had been one of profound displeasure. the kind of expression a man of God wore when forced to confront human weakness and moral failing. By 9 o'clock, the telephone had rung twice with updates from various village informants. By 10, Miss Marple had constructed a preliminary web of relationships and secrets that would have impressed a spider. Lord Ashford had been 56 years old, moderately wealthy, but with an estate that required more maintenance than his income could comfortably provide. His marriage to Lady Ashford, a woman some 20 years his junior, had been, by all accounts, a somewhat cool arrangement. More a joining of estates than hearts. They maintained separate bedrooms at the Hall, a fact that was somehow common knowledge despite the discretion one might expect from such matters. Malcolm, his son from an earlier marriage, stood to inherit substantially upon his father's death. Malcolm worked in some capacity in London's financial sector. The exact nature of his work was unclear, which was itself suspicious in a village where most people's business was transparent as glass. David Garrett, the nephew, had apparently arrived in St. Mary Mead with unexpected bitterness regarding his estrangement from the Ashford family. His mother had died 10 years ago, cut off from her family's money and support after her elopement. David had grown up in relative poverty in London, raised by an actress turned boarding house innkeeper, and had only recently traced his family and returned to the village where he was born. And Elena, young, attractive Elena, had somehow become enmeshed in the household as both companion and, according to the whispers, something considerably more intimate. Lord Ashford's infatuation had apparently been the source of significant household tension, particularly from Lady Ashford, who had taken to spending increasing amounts of time away from the Hall. Miss Marple set down her knitting and gazed into the fire. In her long experience, murderers were not so different from the people she had known all her life. They did not emerge from nowhere, fully formed in their wickedness. Rather, they grew from ordinary soil, from grievances and desires, from debts both financial and emotional, from the small humiliations and large betrayals that accumulated like dust in the corners of a house. The question was not so much who could have wanted Lord Ashford dead, but rather who had the precise combination of motive, opportunity, and the particular kind of cold determination required to saw through a metal support and wait for the perfect moment to strike. She thought of David Garrett's face as the angel fell. Had there been surprise there, or had she seen what she expected to see? She thought of Malcolm Ashford's absence from the festival, which she had noticed though few others seemed to have. Why would a son, visiting his father's village, not appear at the village's major event? She thought of Elena's trembling hands as the police asked their initial questions, and wondered whether that trembling came from fear of discovery or fear of something else entirely. And she thought of Reverend Thurston's knowledge, for it was clear that the Reverend had known something about Lord Ashford that had troubled his conscience deeply. Outside, St. Mary Mead settled into a restless Christmas Eve. The decorations that had seemed so cheerful that afternoon now looked garish and inappropriate, like makeup on a corpse. The angel remained in the market square, cordoned off and surrounded by nothing but cold stone and winter darkness. And in her sitting room Miss Marple continued to knit, her needles clicking like a clock, counting down toward revelation. The following morning brought Inspector Craddock from the county police, a man in his early 50s with sharp grey eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to finding truth beneath layers of rural dissimulation. Miss Marple, observed his arrival from her sitting-room window, watching as he was escorted to the Ashford Hall by Constable Pettigrew, who looked simultaneously relieved and anxious at the prospect of professional assistance. She had met Inspector Craddock once before, at a county function some years ago. He was the sort of man who actually listened when elderly ladies spoke, which automatically elevated him above 90% of the male population. The initial theory, as presented by Constable Pettigrew in his preliminary report, was straightforward enough. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the Angel support mechanism, knowing that Lord Ashford would be standing beneath it at a particular moment. The question of who had positioned Lord Ashford in precisely that spot, and how they had ensured his cooperation in standing still long enough for the plan to execute, was less clear. By mid-morning, the village had organized itself into various investigative committees, each pursuing theories with the enthusiasm of terriers after rabbits. The most popular theory, which had taken root at the market square and spread like fungus through the morning tea services, involved David Garrett as the primary suspect. Young man, bitter about his family situation, recently arrived with a grievance. The logic was difficult to fault, at least on the surface. Miss Marple, however, sat in the window of the village library, ostensibly reading the latest Agatha Christie novel, though she found it rather pedestrian compared to real life, and listened to the conversations swirling around her. "He was seen near the market square on the morning of the festival," reported Mrs. Andrews, the postmistress, to anyone who would listen. "My assistant saw him, lurking," she said, added Mr. Bantham, the hardware man, "coming back to the village just in time to murder his uncle and presumably inherit something. That's how these things work, isn't it?" Miss Marple turned a page in her novel without reading it. David Garrett certainly had motive. The long-standing family rift, the comparative poverty of his upbringing, the knowledge that his uncle possessed considerable wealth. But motive alone, as any observer of human nature knew, was merely the most obvious piece of a much larger puzzle. At lunchtime, she encountered Reverend Thurston walking toward the church with his shoulders bent under some invisible weight. She had timed her walk deliberately to cross his path, a talent she had perfected over 7 decades. "Reverend," she said warmly. The Reverend started slightly, as though his thoughts had been very far away indeed. When he recognized Miss Marple, something flickered across his face. Relief, perhaps, or resignation. "Miss Marple. Yes, dreadful is quite the word. Simply dreadful," Miss Marple asked gently, matching his pace as they walked toward the church. The Reverend was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the demands of pastoral discretion against his obvious need to confide. "I cannot speak of confessional matters," he said finally, "but I can say that Lord Ashford was a man struggling with his conscience. He had done things, committed acts that weighed heavily upon him. Just last week, he came to see me. He wished to make restitution for past wrongs." Miss Marple noted this with interest. An intended change of will was, in her experience, the sort of information that travelled quickly through families and circles of influence. If Lord Ashford had announced his intention to alter his inheritance arrangements, then the motives of his son and nephew had suddenly become considerably more complicated. She asked carefully. "No," the Reverend said, "but I gathered it was someone he felt he had wronged, someone deserving of compensation." By afternoon, Inspector Craddock had begun his formal interviews, establishing the movements of each potentially interested party on the morning of the festival. The interviews were conducted in the village hall, with Constable Pettigrew standing awkwardly nearby, attempting to look professionally competent. Miss Marple happened to pass the hall on her way to the post office and observed as Malcolm Ashford emerged from his interview looking rather grim. The younger Ashford was a well-dressed man in his late 20s, with his father's sharp features but without his father's presence. He looked, to Miss Marple's observant eye, like a man whose expectations had recently undergone significant revision. Following Malcolm came Eleanor, the Polish companion, her eyes red from crying, but her bearing oddly defiant. She wore the red coat again, though it had been hastily brushed, and her dark hair was pinned back with slightly less care than one might expect. She paused on the steps of the hall and lit a cigarette with trembling fingers, a small act of rebellion that suggested a young woman testing the limits of her newfound freedom. Lady Ashford appeared at 2 o'clock, arriving in a motor car from a neighbouring village where, apparently, she had spent the previous evening with a friend. She wore black, though it was surely too early for such formal mourning, and her face bore an expression of carefully arranged sorrow that did not quite reach her eyes. And then there was David Garrett, who was interviewed for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he looked both angry and afraid, a combination Miss Marple had learned to recognize as the response of someone who possessed inconvenient knowledge, but insufficient proof. That evening, Miss Marple attended the small service the Reverend had organized. A quiet prayer for Lord Ashford's soul, attended by perhaps 30 villagers. The attendance was respectable if not enthusiastic, and Miss Marple spent the service observing rather than praying, which she suspected God would forgive given the circumstances. She noticed that David Garrett did not attend. Neither did Malcolm Ashford. Eleanor came, however, sitting alone in a back pew, her hands folded tightly in her lap. And there was something in the tightness of her hands, the set of her jaw, that suggested the young woman was bracing herself for something. Later, as Miss Marple walked home through the darkness, her mind returned to the central puzzle. Who had wanted Lord Ashford dead enough to plan his murder with such deliberation? The answer, she suspected, involved not one person acting from a single motive, but rather a complicated tangle of grievances and desires, of secrets and desperate circumstances. The angel remained in the market square, its golden wings glinting under the street lamp, its serene expression now shy, somehow accusing. And somewhere in the village, among the people Miss Marple had known for decades, walked a murderer who believed themselves clever enough to escape judgment. Miss Marple smiled slightly to herself. In her experience, murderers were rarely as clever as they believed. They were usually just ordinary people who had allowed themselves to be driven by desperation or rage into doing extraordinary things. And it was the small, ordinary details, the things no one else noticed, that always told the truth. By the third day following Lord Ashford's death, Inspector Craddock had settled upon David Garrett as the primary suspect, a conclusion that seemed to satisfy most of the village's collective conscience. The logic was, on the surface, compelling. The young man had motive, opportunity, and the lack of substantial alibi that made him convenient to suspect. David Garrett had admitted to being in the village the morning of the festival. He had claimed to be taking a walk, clearing his head, thinking about his situation. He had no witness to corroborate this claim, a fact that grew more damning with each retelling by Mrs. Andrews and her ever-expanding circle of informants. He was seen wearing work clothes, reported Mrs. Prothero at the Wednesday afternoon Women's Institute meeting, which Miss Marple attended while pretending to focus on her embroidery. Work clothes, mind you, as though he'd been doing manual labor. The theory gained traction, fed by the human impulse toward narrative simplicity. A wronged nephew bitter about his family situation, returns to his native village and exacts revenge upon the uncle who had ignored his suffering. The story had the shape of tragedy, the weight of poetic justice, and most importantly, it allowed the respectable people of St. Mary Mead to continue believing in their own safety and morality. Inspector Craddock, however, appeared less entirely convinced. Miss Marple observed him on Thursday morning, standing in the market square examining the fallen angel with the intense focus of a man who sensed inconsistencies in the narrative he had been offered. She arranged to encounter him near the library, where he had paused to purchase a newspaper from young Timothy Fletcher. "Inspector," she said warmly. Craddock turned, recognized her, and his expression softened slightly. "Miss Marple. Yes, exhausting is adequate." Miss Marple adjusted her gloves with apparent casualness. The inspector glanced around to ensure they were not overheard. The timing, primarily. The angel was rigged to fall when Lord Ashford stood beneath it. Yet his positioning at that particular spot was somewhat circumstantial. He moved through the festival quite freely, talking with various people, examining the stalls. "Precisely," Miss Marple murmured. "Exactly my thought," Craddock said. "And yet David Garrett has no particular gift for manipulation that I can discern. The young man is straightforward to the point of rudeness." Miss Marple considered this assessment. From her own observations, she had formed a similar impression of David Garrett. A young man of evident intelligence but limited subtlety, prone to displaying his emotions rather than concealing them. "There is also the matter of the mechanism itself," Craddock continued. "The support had been deliberately weakened, but the cut was not clean. It was somewhat crude, actually, the work of someone in a hurry, or someone lacking proper tools." Miss Marple asked. "I believe," Craddock said carefully, "that someone wishes very much for David Garrett to be framed. The work clothes that were observed, I have examined them myself. They show no trace of metal dust, no filing residue. The young man claims he was wearing those clothes during his morning walk." Over the following 2 days, Miss Marple observed the secondary suspects with renewed attention. Malcolm Ashford had returned to London on Thursday, claiming that his affairs required his presence, but not before appearing noticeably relieved at his father's death. The inheritance would come to him, of course. Lord Ashford's stated intention to alter his will had been merely that, an intention never executed. The will itself, drawn up 5 years prior, left the substantial estate and considerable investments to Malcolm as the legitimate heir. Yet Malcolm's financial position, Miss Marple had learned through careful inquiry, was considerably more precarious than his surface prosperity suggested. A friend of Mrs. Banfield's nephew worked in a London accounting firm and had mentioned, somewhat indiscreetly, that Malcolm Ashford's recent investment ventures had been unsuccessful. There were whispers of debt, of creditors growing impatient. Lady Ashford, meanwhile, had begun the process of mourning with an efficiency that suggested she had been practicing for some time. She had engaged a solicitor from the nearby town and was making inquiries about her own financial independence under the terms of her marriage settlement. She had also, Miss Marple noted with interest, begun spending considerably more time in the company of the Reverend Thurston, seeking spiritual comfort and guidance with a frequency that struck Miss Marple as somewhat theatrical. As for Elena, the young Polish companion had fallen into a state of anxious limbo. With Lord Ashford deceased, her position at the Hall was suddenly uncertain. Lady Ashford had made no explicit announcement regarding Elena's future, but the atmosphere of the household had apparently become frigid. The girl continued to stay at the hall, but her movements were increasingly circumscribed. It was on Friday afternoon that Miss Marple encountered Elena at the market, where the girl was purchasing supplies with a list provided by the hall's housekeeper. Eleanor looked thinner than she had at the festival, her eyes hollow with something approaching despair. "Miss Elena," Miss Marple said gently, falling into step beside her. Elena's head snapped up, alarm flickering across her face before she recognized Miss Marple's harmless elderly presence. "Yes, Miss Marple. Difficult, yes. Everything has changed. I do not know." She paused, clearly weighing what she could safely say. "Lord Ashford was kind to you, I gather," Miss Marple said carefully. Eleanor's expression crumpled slightly. "He was kind, yes, very kind. More kind than—" She stopped herself. "He said he would help me. He said he would provide for me. My family in Poland, they are not wealthy. I came here to earn money, to help them." Miss Marple asked gently. "His wife," Eleanor said bitterly. "She saw me as a threat." Eleanor laughed, a short, bitter sound. "I am 23 years old. I work as a companion. What designs could I have? But she was jealous, I think. He paid attention to me." Miss Marple filed this away, confirmation of what the village gossip had suggested, but interesting to hear the emotional truth beneath the speculation. Lord Ashford's infatuation with Elena had clearly been genuine, and Elena's affection for him, while perhaps not romantic love, had been real enough. Miss Marple asked. "I do not know," Elena said quietly. "Perhaps I will return to London, find work there." She looked at Miss Marple with sudden intensity. "Do you think they will charge David Garrett with the murder?" Miss Marple asked. Elena's response was immediate and definitive. No, I do not believe this. David is angry, yes, but not this angry, not this clever." As Miss Marple walked home with this observation settling into her already complex understanding of the situation, she found herself contemplating a particular uncomfortable truth: that in this small village there were at least 3 people with adequate motive to kill Lord Ashford, and at least 3 more with complicated secrets they wished remained hidden. The police seemed satisfied with David Garrett as their suspect, but Miss Marple was beginning to understand that the truth was considerably more intricate than the convenient narrative Inspector Craddock had been offered. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer walked free, confident in their own cleverness, believing themselves safely hidden behind the obvious suspect. And Miss Marple, sitting in her evening armchair with her knitting needles clicking steadily, was only just beginning to perceive the shape of what had truly occurred. The Christmas decorations that had seemed so festive a week prior now appeared tragic, like mourning clothes hung on a living body. The village had attempted to maintain some semblance of holiday spirit, but the pervasive unease of the unresolved murder had dampened enthusiasm considerably. Most homes still displayed their wreaths and lights, but the usual caroling and festive gatherings had been postponed with what Miss Marple recognized as collective guilt, as though celebrating would be a betrayal of propriety. By Saturday, a week after Lord Ashford's death, Inspector Craddock had announced that David Garrett would be taken into custody for questioning regarding the murder. The news spread through the village with the speed of spilled mercury, dividing itself into multiple rivulets of gossip, each stream finding its own path through the community. It was on the morning of this announcement that Miss Marple noticed something peculiar. She had been examining the decorations at the market square, where the angel still remained, now covered with a protective canvas, following the inspector's thorough examination. The wooden framework was clearly visible, and the damage to the support mechanism was evident even to the casual observer. But it was not the angel itself that had caught her attention. It was the arrangement of the stalls. Miss Marple had a very clear memory of the festival layout from the day of the murder. The refreshment table had been positioned near the angel's base, the handicraft stalls arranged in a semicircle, the carol singers stationed by the fountain. She had observed the placement carefully, as she observed everything, and she had filed the details away in that portion of her mind reserved for patterns and arrangements. The current arrangement was subtly different. The refreshment table, which had been directly beneath the angel's eventual landing point, had been moved approximately 6 feet to the east. This was a detail of no particular significance. The committee would have rearranged things as part of the cleanup effort. Yet something about the original placement nagged at her. She mentioned it somewhat casually to Constable Pettigrew, whom she encountered at the post office. "The refreshment table," she said. Pettigrew, who was purchasing stamps and who seemed grateful for any distraction from the more demanding aspects of the investigation, nodded. "Yes, Miss Marple. The committee deemed it improper to maintain refreshment service at a murder scene, you understand." "Of course," Miss Marple said. Pettigrew frowned, clearly unsure why this detail mattered. "I'm not certain, Miss Marple. I wasn't present during the morning setup." Mrs. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Phyllis Underwood at her home, a task that required considerable patience, as Mrs. Underwood was a woman of enthusiastic but somewhat scattered sensibility. They discussed the festival extensively, the preparations, the decorations, the arrangements, and gradually, through careful questioning that appeared to be merely polite interest in the event's logistics, Miss Marple extracted the information she sought. "The refreshment table," she said, "was positioned originally near the fountain, wasn't it?" Mrs. Underwood brightened. "Yes, you have an excellent memory, Miss Marple. It was moved on the morning of the festival itself. You see, Lord Ashford felt that the table was too close to the angel, blocking the view. He suggested we move it, and of course one doesn't refuse Lord Ashford." Miss Marple asked gently. "He said something about wanting the angel to be the central focus, without an obstruction. I thought it quite particular, but he was donating the angel, after all, so one honoured his wishes." This detail, seemingly inconsequential, was actually rather significant. Lord Ashford had deliberately ensured that the refreshment table was not directly beneath the angel, which meant that anyone standing at or near the refreshment table would not be in danger when the angel fell, which meant that someone, the person who had repositioned the table, or more precisely, the person who had requested that it be repositioned, had known in advance that the angel would fall. And more importantly, that person had taken steps to ensure that specific individuals would not be in the danger zone. Miss Marple's mind began to work through the implications. If the murderer was concerned about who might be hit by the falling angel, then they must have possessed knowledge of who would be standing where during the festival. They must have controlled, or believed they controlled, the positioning of Lord Ashford himself. Or they must have known that Lord Ashford would naturally position himself in a particular location based on habit or preference. That evening, Miss Marple requested a private conversation with Inspector Craddock, who had established himself in the village for several more days, pending the completion of his investigation. They met in the library, away from prying eyes. "I may have observed something relevant," Miss Marple said, presenting her theory regarding the refreshment table's relocation. Craddock listened with the careful attention she had come to appreciate in him. "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that someone had sufficient knowledge of Lord Ashford's habits and preferences to predict his movements." Craddock frowned. If the goal was simply to kill Lord Ashford, because, Miss Marple said gently, an indiscriminate catastrophe that injured multiple people would create complications. The murderer wanted a specific death, accomplished with minimal collateral damage. Craddock rose and paced the library, his hands clasped behind his back. That would suggest the murderer was not David Garrett, despite all appearances. "Precisely," Miss Marple said. Craddock turned to face her. Miss Marple considered the question. The answer lay not in grand dramatic gestures, but in the small details, in work clothes without metal dust, in conversation between a vicar and a troubled man, in a young woman's complicated affection, in the movements of family members seeking inheritance, in the careful rearrangement of festival furniture. "That," she said finally, "is what we must discover through observation rather than assumption." What neither of them knew in that moment was that the true murderer was watching their investigation with increasing anxiety, understanding now that David Garrett would not serve as the permanent scapegoat, and that more direct action might soon be required. The Christmas season continued its relentless progression toward its conclusion, and with it came the growing likelihood that the murderer's carefully constructed edifice of deception was beginning to crack under the weight of careful scrutiny. David Garrett was released from custody on Monday morning, much to the visible disappointment of Mrs. Andrews and her network of informants. Inspector Craddock, having found insufficient evidence to formally charge the young man with murder, was forced to acknowledge the insufficiency of circumstantial suspicion. Constable Pettigrew appeared both relieved and frustrated by this development, as though he had been deprived of a satisfying conclusion to an otherwise straightforward case. David Garrett, however, did not return quietly to the boarding house to nurse his grievances in private. Instead, he went directly to the Ashford Hall, arriving with the determined air of a man who had reached the limit of his patience with discretion. Miss Marple, who happened to be visiting Mrs. Craddock, a distant relation of the inspector, and a woman who enjoyed neither mystery nor excitement but possessed considerable awareness of household dynamics, observed David's arrival from across the garden. "He looks absolutely furious," commented Mrs. Craddock, peering through the garden gate with the interest of a woman for whom village dramas constituted primary entertainment. "Do you suppose he's come to murder someone else?" Miss Marple, however, was more interested in the reaction his arrival provoked. Within moments, Lady Ashford appeared at the hall's entrance, her face going pale. Behind her came Elena, whose expression shifted from anxiety to something approaching hope. The conversation that ensued was conducted at sufficient volume to be audible even at a distance, though Miss Marple politely declined to move closer, despite Mrs. Craddock's obvious desire to do so. "You knew?" David's voice carried clearly across the garden. "I don't know what you're talking about." Lady Ashford's response was cold, imperious. "My recent detention," David said, "was clearly orchestrated. Someone needed a convenient suspect, and I was conveniently available." It was at this moment that Malcolm Ashford, who apparently had not returned to London after all, appeared in the hall's doorway. His expression hardened considerably upon seeing his cousin. "David," Malcolm said, his voice carrying a warning. David turned to face his cousin directly. "I've had considerable time to think during my detention, Malcolm. Time to remember conversations I'd overheard. To understand implications I'd initially missed." Miss Marple found herself appreciating David Garrett's analytical abilities, despite her earlier assessment that he lacked subtlety. The young man had clearly spent his time in custody productively, constructing theories and connecting previously disparate observations. "Father intended to change his will," David continued. "He intended to provide for Elena, to make some restitution for his actions. That would have reduced the inheritance considerably. But more importantly, Father had recently discovered something, I don't know what precisely, but something that troubled him deeply." Malcolm's face flushed. "This is precisely the sort of speculation that leads nowhere except toward additional criminal charges." But Elena had stepped forward, her young face bearing the marks of stress and uncertainty. "David is correct," she said quietly. "Lord Ashford discovered something." Miss Marple heard herself ask aloud, stepping forward from her position at the garden gate. Lady Ashford's face went from pale to actively grey. Malcolm's expression shifted from anger to something approaching desperation. And David, meeting Miss Marple's eyes, seemed to recognize in her the kind of intelligent observation he had been seeking. "I'm not entirely certain," David said, "but I have reason to believe it concerned the circumstances of my mother's death. She left this household under cloud, cast out for her elopement. My uncle, Lord Ashford, has always claimed he had nothing to do with her removal from the family. But I've recently learned that my grandmother's will was quite generous to my mother. Yet my mother never received her inheritance." Malcolm took a step forward. "This is absurd. You can't possibly know." "I have the solicitor's records," David said calmly. "I hired someone to investigate after I arrived in the village. My mother's inheritance, a considerable sum, was redirected to the Ashford estate through a series of transactions that required authorization signatures. Your signature, Malcolm." The silence that followed was absolute. "My mother spent her life in poverty," David continued, his voice dropping lower but becoming somehow more intense. "While you lived in comfort, enjoyed the benefits of the estate, made your investments and your ventures. She died believing herself rejected by her family. But it was theft, wasn't it?" Lady Ashford sank slowly into a nearby chair, as though her knees could no longer support her weight. Elena made a small sound of distress, moving toward the older woman with instinctive compassion. "Lord Ashford discovered this," Elena said. It was not a question. "He came to me 3 weeks ago," Malcolm said, his voice now drained of its earlier confidence. "He said he had uncovered discrepancies in the old accounts. He said he was ashamed that our father, my grandfather, had manipulated him into signing documents he didn't fully understand at the time." The words hung in the air like the angel itself had hung, suspended above the market square before the wires gave way. "And that reduced your inheritance significantly," David said. "How much, approximately?" Malcolm didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The truth had already written itself across his face. Miss Marple observed all of this with the careful attention she had brought to bear on human nature for 70 years. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a coherent pattern, though the central architecture of the crime remained obscured. Inspector Craddock should hear this conversation, she said quietly. All of you, actually. As she spoke, she was already mentally reconstructing the events of the festival, understanding now how the precise arrangement of circumstances had been achieved, how Lord Ashford had been positioned exactly where the murderer required him to be. The Christmas decorations continued to twinkle innocently throughout the village, but in the Ashford Hall, secrets that had been buried for decades were finally being dragged into the light, and Miss Marple understood, with the peculiar clarity that came from years of observation, precisely what had occurred on the morning of the festival. She understood who had killed Lord Ashford, and more importantly, why. Inspector Craddock arrived at the Ashford Hall within the hour, summoned by Miss Marple's carefully worded telephone call. He brought with him Sergeant Hopkins and a constable, their arrival generating immediate speculation among the gardeners and staff who witnessed the police vehicles pulling up to the grand entrance. The conversation that had begun in the garden was now relocated to the hall's formal sitting room, where Malcolm, Lady Ashford, David, and Eleanor provided their accounts to Craddock's methodical questioning. Miss Marple remained present at the inspector's invitation, seated quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking softly as she bore witness to the unfolding revelations. Malcolm's account was halting and incomplete, coloured by obvious distress and the weight of long-buried guilt. He confirmed David's discovery regarding the redirected inheritance, a sum exceeding £20,000, a considerable fortune in the years following the Great War. He claimed he had been young, uncertain, overly influenced by his father, the late Lord Ashford the Elder. Father was a domineering man, Malcolm said, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as though seeking stability. He insisted that my uncle's marriage, David's mother's marriage, was unsuitable, that it reflected poorly on the family. When my uncle eloped, Father was furious. He somehow convinced my uncle that allowing David's mother to receive her inheritance would be enabling her rebellion against family standards. I was merely 25 at the time. Yet you understood well enough to benefit from them, Craddock observed dryly. Yes, Malcolm said quietly, and my uncle, the current Lord Ashford, he carried that guilt for nearly 3 decades. Lady Ashford, meanwhile, presented a more interesting complication to the narrative. She confirmed that she had been aware of Lord Ashford's intention to alter his will and to make financial restitution to David. More significantly, she acknowledged that this development had caused considerable marital discord. He said it was the right thing to do, Lady Ashford said, her voice bitter. The right thing to do. As though morality was more important than the stability of our household, the security of our lives. I married him when he was already a man of substance. I expected to enjoy the fruits of that substance. Elena interjected, her voice sharp with offence. David's mother was his own sister. The point remains, Lady Ashford continued, ignoring Elena's interruption, that my position would have been substantially compromised. It was at this juncture that Craddock asked the question that seemed to shift the entire investigation into unexpected territory. Lady Ashford, he said carefully, where precisely were you on the morning of the festival? Lady Ashford's composure, which had been carefully maintained throughout the conversation, cracked visibly. I was at home, preparing for the festival. Why would you ask such a question? Surely you don't imagine. I'm asking because, Craddock said, consulting his notes. 3 separate witnesses have stated that they saw you near the market square in the early morning hours. I don't know what you're talking about, Lady Ashford said, but her voice lacked conviction. You were observed, Craddock continued, wearing work clothes, rather unfashionable attire for a woman of your station. You were in the vicinity of the Angel's framework. The silence that followed was profound. Elena had gone very still, her young face bearing an expression of dawning realization. David's hands had clenched into fists. And Malcolm was looking at his aunt with an expression that mixed disbelief with something approaching horror. "I didn't kill him," Lady Ashford said suddenly, the words tumbling out with desperate urgency. "I examined the framework, yes. I was considering having it reinforced. The whole structure seemed precarious to me, unsuitable for a village festival." "Yet you mentioned nothing of this to the committee," Craddock observed. "You made no official recommendation for structural reinforcement." "Because I knew they would dismiss my concerns." Lady Ashford's voice had taken on a hysterical edge. "The committee would have said I was being overly cautious, that I was attempting to control things beyond my purview." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. There was something in Lady Ashford's explanation that rang partially true, yet fundamentally incomplete. A woman examining a structure for safety purposes would not typically do so in secret in darkness. And a woman concerned about structural integrity would have found alternative means of ensuring reinforcement rather than examining the problem herself in such clandestine fashion. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, breaking her silence, "I wonder if we might examine the area more closely." Craddock, understanding that Miss Marple's observations had thus far proven reliable, agreed. The entire party relocated to the market square, where the angel remained, still covered with its protective canvas. As the covering was removed and the structure laid bare to examination, Miss Marple moved closer to the weakened support that had failed during the festival. The cut was indeed crude, as Craddock had noted. But upon closer examination, Miss Marple observed something else. Something that suggested the work had been done in 2 stages, by 2 different hands using 2 different implements. The initial damage, she said, pointing carefully, was done with precision. Professional work, one might say. Craddock examined the evidence she indicated. "You're suggesting the structure was sabotaged twice?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that the sabotage was considerably more deliberate and carefully planned than a single impulsive act. Someone with knowledge of metalwork, someone perhaps with technical expertise, initiated the weakness." Malcolm had gone completely white. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "No, you can't possibly think." "I think," Miss Marple said, turning to regard him with sad certainty, "that you initiated the sabotage yourself, Malcolm. You discovered what your uncle intended regarding the will and the inheritance. You realized that your financial difficulties, those debts you've accumulated in London, would be addressed only if the inheritance remained intact." "But I didn't intend for him to die," Malcolm said, his voice rising desperately. "I intended to ensure the angel fell during setup, before the festival proper. I intended it to fall empty, with no one nearby." "Then who," Craddock asked slowly, "positioned your uncle directly beneath the falling structure?" All eyes turned toward Lady Ashford, who had sunk into a nearby chair, her face the color of ash. "He was going to leave me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I overheard him speaking to his solicitor on the telephone. He intended to divorce me, to remove me from the hall, to leave me with only the minimal provision required by our marriage settlement. The will was being altered, the inheritance was being distributed, and now I was to be cast aside as well." The confession hung in the cold air of the market square, like the angel itself had hung, suspended between intention and consequence. Inspector Craddock's expression was one of grim satisfaction. The case was no longer a puzzle, but a tragedy, the kind of sordid human drama that populated his professional experience with depressing regularity. Yet Miss Marple remained thoughtful, her pale blue eyes moving between Malcolm and Lady Ashford, with the careful observation of someone who sensed incompleteness in the narrative that had been offered. The confession had come too easily, she reflected. Two guilty parties, each seeking to shoulder blame, each attempting to construct a version of events that minimized their own culpability while acknowledging sufficient wrongdoing to account for the crime. Perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, we might discuss the precise sequence of events on the morning of the festival. Craddock, who had come to respect Miss Marple's methodical approach, gestured for her to continue. Malcolm, Miss Marple addressed the younger Ashford directly. You completed the sabotage of the Angel's support mechanism on the evening before the festival, I presume? Malcolm nodded miserably. I used a saw from the hall's gardening shed. I knew the initial damage had already been done. I could see it when I examined the framework that afternoon. I assumed it was structural degradation, age, simple accident waiting to happen. But then I understood what it meant. And you chose to complete the sabotage rather than report it, Craddock observed. Yes, Malcolm said. I panicked. I thought if I finished the job properly, made the cut clean and complete, I could ensure the Angel fell during setup, before anyone was beneath it. Yet you did nothing to inform anyone of the structural danger, Miss Marple noted. You made no attempt to ensure the area would be cordoned off during setup. I was going to warn someone, Malcolm insisted. I was going to send an anonymous note to Mrs. Underwood advising that the structure was unsafe. But then morning came, and I lost my nerve. Miss Marple turned to Lady Ashford. And you, madam, observed Lord Ashford moving through the festival grounds. You knew, from your earlier examination of the framework, that the structure was dangerous. You knew that the support was weakened. I didn't position him, Lady Ashford said, though her voice lacked conviction. I mentioned to him that the Angel was quite spectacular from a certain angle. I suggested he stand beneath it while I fetched my camera so that I could photograph him with the Angel as backdrop. A memorial, I said. And he, trusting you, complied, Miss Marple said gently. Yes, Lady Ashford whispered. But you didn't return, Miss Marple continued. Instead, you moved away, ensuring that you were at a safe distance when the structure failed. You may not have actively murdered your husband, madam, but you ensured that he would be positioned directly beneath a structure you knew to be dangerously weakened. Elena had begun to weep silently, her young face bearing the weight of understanding what Lord Ashford's fate had truly been. David stood rigid, his expression hardened into something between grief and rage. There remains, however, Miss Marple said, a question that troubles me. How did Lady Ashford know, with such certainty, that the Angel would fall at precisely the moment when Lord Ashford was positioned beneath it? Structures that are weakened do not fall according to convenient schedule. Craddock frowned. I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said, that Lady Ashford required assistance in ensuring the Angel fell at the precise moment required. The inspector's expression sharpened. He turned to examine the framework more closely, his trained eye moving across the structure with new purpose. After a moment, he called out to Sergeant Hopkins. "There," Craddock pointed. "Along the upper crossbeam. Rope burns, fairly fresh." Miss Marple nodded slowly. It was at this moment that a figure emerged from among the market stalls, a figure that had been present throughout the entire conversation, standing silently in the shadows, observing the unfolding drama with an expression of defeat and resignation. It was Reverend Thurston. "I did it," the Reverend said quietly, stepping forward into the grey winter light. "I applied the stress to the structure." The silence that followed was absolute. The Reverend's face was a study in spiritual anguish, the features of a man whose conscience had finally overwhelmed his complicity. "Lady Ashford came to me 3 days before the festival," he said. "She was in considerable distress. She confided in me, not as a parishioner seeking guidance, but as a woman desperate for assistance. She told me what her husband intended." "And you agreed to help her murder her husband," Craddock said flatly. "No," the Reverend said with surprising firmness. "I agreed to help her prevent the tragedy she foresaw. She told me the angel was unstable, that it might fall during the festival. She asked me to be present, to pull on the rope she had attached to the structure, to trigger the collapse before anyone could be injured." "You believed her," Miss Marple said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "I wanted to believe her," the Reverend corrected. "I wanted to believe that I was preventing harm rather than causing it. But I am not a fool, Miss Marple. I realized when I pulled that rope and the angel fell directly onto Lord Ashford's standing figure, that I had been manipulated into committing murder. Lady Ashford had positioned him deliberately. She had known precisely when he would be beneath the structure." Craddock asked. The Reverend looked toward Miss Marple. Because Miss Marple's questions, her careful observation, made it clear that the truth would eventually emerge. Because I cannot continue to live with the weight of what I have done. Inspector Craddock signalled to his officers. As the Reverend was led away, Lady Ashford followed, her composure finally shattered, her calculated innocence revealed as the elaborate deception it had been. Malcolm remained in the market square, a man confronted with the reality that his initial crime, his attempt at cautious sabotage, had been weaponized by others into actual murder. Miss Marple stood quietly, observing the removal of the guilty parties, her knitting needles still clasped in her hands. The Christmas decorations continued to twinkle throughout the village, oblivious to the darkness that had been revealed beneath their festive glitter. Elena moved to David's side, offering silent comfort to a young man whose family had proved far more complicated and tragic than he could have imagined. And Miss Marple, as always, reflected upon the nature of human weakness, the ways that desperation corrupted the soul, and how often the greatest crimes emerged not from evil intentions, but from the collision of ordinary people driven to extraordinary measures by circumstances they could not control. The angel remained in the market square, no longer golden and serene, but transformed into an instrument of death, a monument to the darkness that could hide behind the most respectable facades. The formal hearings took place over the course of 2 weeks, extending well past the Christmas season that had seemed so festive when the angel first arrived in St. Mary Mead. The courthouse in the neighboring county town was filled with witnesses, evidence, and the grim machinery of justice, operating with its characteristic slowness and precision. Inspector Craddock had constructed a meticulous case, supported by Miss Marple's careful observations regarding the timing of the sabotage, the positioning of Lord Ashford, and the mechanical means by which the angel had been made to fall at a predetermined moment. The evidence was overwhelming, though the culpability of each defendant remained a matter requiring careful legal distinction. Malcolm Ashford faced charges of conspiracy and attempted sabotage, though the prosecution acknowledged that his original intent had been to prevent rather than cause injury. His sentence, when it came, was relatively lenient: 3 years imprisonment, with the possibility of reduction for good conduct. Reverend Thurston's case was more complicated. He had directly participated in the mechanism that caused Lord Ashford's death, pulling the rope that triggered the collapse. Yet his participation had been undertaken under what he claimed was false pretenses, believing himself to be preventing rather than causing tragedy. The legal arguments extended for weeks, examining the intersection of complicity, manipulation, and culpable ignorance. It was Lady Ashford, however, who faced the most serious charges. She was accused of murder with premeditation, of deliberately positioning her husband beneath a structure she knew to be dangerous, and of manipulating both her nephew and the village vicar into participating in her crime. The evidence against her was circumstantial but compelling. The testimony of multiple witnesses regarding her early morning examination of the angel, her deliberate positioning of her husband, her convenient absence from the danger zone, and most damning, the testimony of Reverend Thurston regarding the false pretenses under which he had been enlisted. It was during the 3rd week of the hearings that Miss Marple was called to provide her expert testimony regarding the sequence of events. She sat in the witness box, a small elderly woman in dove grey, and calmly explained her observations regarding the refreshment table's relocation, the double sabotage of the support mechanism, and the psychological mechanisms by which Lady Ashford had manipulated those around her into becoming instruments of her will. The defense attorney attempted to create reasonable doubt, suggesting that Lady Ashford's positioning of her husband had been innocent, that his decision to stand beneath the angel was coincidental rather than orchestrated. But Miss Marple's testimony was precise, detailed, and devastating in its clarity. Lady Ashford, Miss Marple said calmly, is a woman of considerable intelligence and determination. She understood the structure's weakness because she had examined it herself. She knew that any additional stress would cause the framework to collapse. She positioned her husband beneath it by the simple mechanism of suggesting a photographic composition. But you cannot know her intentions, the defense attorney pressed. No, Miss Marple agreed, but I can observe human behavior, and I have done so for many decades. Lady Ashford's actions demonstrate a pattern consistent with deliberate, premeditated murder. She examined the structure in secret. She positioned her victim with apparent innocence. She ensured her own distance from danger. And she manipulated a clergyman of good faith into becoming her accomplice. These actions do not suggest accident or impulsive crime. The prosecution rested its case, and the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Lady Ashford was found guilty of murder. Reverend Thurston was found guilty of manslaughter, the jury accepting that his participation, while direct, had been undertaken under false pretenses and without knowledge of the true outcome. Malcolm Ashford, having cooperated fully with the prosecution and provided detailed testimony regarding the initial sabotage, received the reduced sentence already noted. Sentencing took place on a cold January morning. Lady Ashford received a sentence of life imprisonment, her face remaining composed even as the words of the judge fell like stones into still water. Reverend Thurston received 15 years, his expression one of profound relief, at the mercy of a sentence that acknowledged his moral culpability without condemning him to spend his remaining years in captivity. The village of St. Mary Mead received the verdicts with mixed emotions. There was satisfaction in the resolution of the crime, certainly, but there was also the peculiar sadness that comes from seeing respected members of a community revealed to be capable of darkness. The Reverend had been beloved in his position for nearly 20 years. Lady Ashford, despite her coldness and occasional imperviousness, had been a fixture of village society, a woman of substance and apparent respectability. That respectability had been revealed as a facade, though Miss Marple reflected that this was often the case. The respectable people were frequently the most dangerous, for they had learned early how to present the world with an acceptable face while concealing the turbulence beneath. It was on the day after sentencing that Miss Marple received a visitor at her home. Elena, the young Polish woman, arrived with David Garrett, both of them bearing the marks of individuals who had survived a profound trauma and were slowly reconstructing their understanding of the world. "Miss Marple," Eleanor said, her English improved considerably through weeks of stress and necessity, "I wished to thank you. Without your observations, without your testimony, I would have been viewed always with suspicion. Lord Ashford's affection for me would have seemed to suggest motive." "I observed," Miss Marple said gently, "that you genuinely cared for Lord Ashford, despite the circumstances of your relationship. I observed that your anxiety came from fear of instability rather than fear of discovery," Miss Marple asked, addressing both young people. David spoke first. "I have decided to remain in St. Mary Mead, at least temporarily. The legal questions regarding my mother's inheritance have been settled. The funds will be returned to my name, along with additional compensation for the years of deprivation," Miss Marple asked. "The hall will be sold," David said. "It belongs to me technically as my uncle's closest male relative, but I have no wish to live there. The house carries too much sorrow, too much history of family corruption." Elena took David's hand. "We are considering moving to London together," she said shyly. "David has connections there and I have experience as a companion." "A sensible plan," Miss Marple said warmly. After they had departed, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room with a cup of Earl Grey, reflecting upon the case that had consumed so much of her attention for nearly a month. The mystery had been resolved, the guilty had been punished according to the law, and some semblance of justice had been achieved. Yet Miss Marple was aware that justice, true justice, was rarely as complete as the legal system suggested. Malcolm Ashford had been driven by financial desperation, a desperation that spoke to systemic failures in how young men were expected to manage their affairs. Reverend Thurston had been manipulated by a woman who understood human psychology with devastating accuracy, who had weaponized his own goodness against him. And Lady Ashford had been driven to murder not by evil inclination, but by the simple human desire for security, for status, for the life she had come to believe was her due. These were not excuses, Miss Marple reminded herself. They were merely explanations, and explanations did not negate culpability, yet understanding the circumstances that had driven people to commit extraordinary crimes seemed important to her, important for maintaining compassion even in the face of darkness. The Christmas season had passed, the decorations had been taken down, and the village had begun to return to its ordinary rhythms. But St. Mary Mead would never quite be the same. The angel, no longer golden and serene, had been dismantled and removed, leaving only an absence in the market square where it had stood, and Miss Marple, settling into her armchair with her knitting, prepared to return to the quiet observation that had always been her primary occupation, watching the small dramas of village life, understanding the hidden motivations that drove people toward their fates, and maintaining the kind of clear-eyed compassion that came only from decades of seeing people, truly seeing them, in all their complexity and weakness and occasional grace. February arrived in St. Mary Mead with the bleak precision that characterized English winter in its final weeks. The snow that had seemed festive at Christmas now appeared merely grey and worn, trampled into submission by the village's ordinary traffic. The market square, which had hosted the angel and its attendant tragedy, had been restored to its usual function, a modest gathering place for the weekly market, the monthly committee meetings, and the casual commerce of village life. The Ashford Hall stood empty, its windows like closed eyes, its gardens untended and slowly reverting to a more natural state. David Garrett had engaged a solicitor to arrange its sale, though few in the village possessed either the resources or the inclination to purchase a house now permanently tainted by association with murder. It would eventually sell to a family from London seeking rural retirement, people unfamiliar with the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls, approaching the property with fresh eyes unmarked by history. The village church had acquired a new temporary vicar, a younger man named Thornton, no relation to the deposed reverend, who conducted his services with a somewhat tentative manner, aware that he was operating in the shadow of his predecessor's fall from grace. The congregation had diminished slightly, though whether this was due to the reverend's absence or to the lingering unease that followed the murder remained unclear. Miss Marple had resumed her ordinary life with the ease of someone for whom extraordinary events were merely interruptions in the ongoing study of human nature. She attended her church services, attended her Women's Institute meetings, attended her various social gatherings, and observed. Always observed. It was at the Women's Institute meeting in mid-February that the full weight of the village's reaction to the murders became evident. Mrs. Prothero was in full eloquence regarding the scandal, her voice modulated to convey both shock and a certain salacious pleasure at the discussion of such juicy matters. "One simply never knows," Mrs. Prothero pronounced, addressing a room of approximately 20 women, engaged in the production of blankets for the parish charity. "One walks among one's neighbours, attends one's social functions, and all the while, beneath the surface, there are currents of the most terrifying darkness. Lady Ashford, whom we all knew, whom we all included in our social circles, a murderer." "To be fair," interjected Mrs. Bantham, the hardware merchant's wife, "she did have cause for distress. Lord Ashford's intention to leave her was a considerable betrayal." Mrs. Prothero's voice rose in pitch. "We are not to understand such things." Miss Marple continued her knitting, listening to the various perspectives swirl around the room. The debate that had erupted was fundamentally about the nature of moral culpability and the proper response to human weakness. Some villagers had moved toward condemning Lady Ashford with absolute certainty, viewing her as irredeemably wicked. Others had begun to construct more complex narratives, acknowledging her culpability, while also understanding the desperation that might have driven her to such extremity. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Underwood called out. She was the Christmas Festival Committee chairman, still somewhat traumatized by the events that had occurred under her organizational purview. You, who were so instrumental in uncovering the truth, what is your view of Lady Ashford's actions? The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward the elderly woman in dove grey, who had become, through the course of the investigation, something of a celebrity in village circles. I think, Miss Marple said carefully, setting down her knitting, that understanding and condemnation are not mutually exclusive. One can comprehend the circumstances that drove Lady Ashford to her crime without excusing the crime itself. She was a woman who had invested her entire identity in a particular social position, who saw that position threatened with dissolution. But surely, Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. Society must condemn such actions, and has done so through the courts and the legal system. But I have observed over many decades that people who commit terrible crimes are rarely entirely evil. They are usually people like ourselves, driven to extremity by circumstances we might hope never to face. Lady Ashford murdered her husband, and she deserves her punishment. The discussion continued, but Miss Marple's intervention had shifted the tone somewhat. The absolute moral certainty that Mrs. Prothero had been attempting to establish had been complicated by the introduction of nuance and understanding. That evening, Miss Marple received a letter. It was from Reverend Thurston, written from the prison where he was serving his sentence. The handwriting was shaky, the words carefully chosen, as though the writer was aware of the gravity of what he was attempting to communicate. Dear Miss Marple, I write to you from my cell, where I have had considerable time to reflect upon the events that led to my incarceration, and the role you played in revealing the truth of those events. I have spent weeks in prayer and contemplation, attempting to understand how I came to participate in the murder of a man I had counseled and attempted to guide towards spiritual improvement. I believe I understand now. I was chosen by Lady Ashford precisely because of my faith, my desire to help others, my fundamental belief in the goodness of human nature. She weaponized my virtues against me, using my compassion as the instrument through which she achieved her evil intent. This is a bitter knowledge, and one I carry with me constantly. Yet I do not regret that you uncovered the truth. Better that I should be imprisoned for a crime I participated in through ignorance than that I should live free knowing that my complicity had gone undetected. The truth, however painful, is the only foundation upon which redemption can be built. I pray for Lord Ashford's soul, for Lady Ashford's soul, and for my own. I pray that my imprisonment might serve some purpose, that suffering might lead to transformation. I do not expect forgiveness, either from God or from the village, but I hope in time that my actions during this final period of service might demonstrate that even those who have failed catastrophically can attempt to rebuild themselves. Yours in service and contrition, Reverend Thurston. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in her correspondence drawer. She felt a profound sadness reading it, a sadness that came from understanding how thoroughly the Reverend had been manipulated, and how deeply he had internalized the guilt for actions undertaken without full knowledge of their consequences. In March, the village hosted a small memorial service for Lord Ashford, conducted by the new temporary vicar. The service was attended by approximately 40 people. fewer than one might expect for a man of his social standing, but understandable given the circumstances of his death and the scandal that had followed. David Garrett attended, standing at the back of the church, his expression unreadable. Malcolm Ashford did not attend, having chosen instead to remain in London, attempting to reconstruct his life and his reputation. Miss Marple attended the service as well, sitting quietly in her usual pew, observing the ways that the village had begun to process the trauma of the previous months. Grief, she understood, was not a simple emotion. It was complicated by the circumstances of death, by the relationship one had with the deceased, by the public nature of the tragedy. Lord Ashford had been a flawed man, complicit in financial wrongdoing, unfaithful to his marriage vows, capable of casual cruelty wrapped in the language of propriety. Yet he had also, in his final weeks, attempted to make restitution, to correct the wrongs of his past, to live according to his conscience. That these attempts had resulted in his murder was a tragedy not because he deserved better treatment, but because the human impulse toward redemption should never be punished with death. As spring began its slow encroachment upon the village, Miss Marple found herself once again engaged with the ordinary dramas of community life. There was a dispute regarding the church roof. There was a romantic entanglement among the younger set that threatened to create significant awkwardness at social gatherings. There was the matter of Mrs. Protheroe's prize roses, which seemed to be responding better to a new fertilizer than anyone had anticipated. These were the concerns that properly occupied a village, Miss Marple reflected. Not murder and scandal, but the small, manageable complications of ordinary life. The Christmas season of the previous year had brought death and revelation, but life, as it always did, continued. The village of St. Mary Mead moved forward, carrying with it the knowledge of what darkness could hide beneath respectability, but also the understanding that such darkness need not define the entire community. And Miss Marple, settling into her chair as spring rain pattered against her windows, prepared for whatever mysteries the coming seasons might bring, knowing that human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, would continue to provide endless material for observation and careful thought. The angel was gone, dismantled and removed, but its absence served as a permanent monument to the dangers of unchecked desperation, of manipulation, of the choice to solve human problems through violence rather than through patience and redemption. By autumn of that year, the scandal of the angel murder had begun to fade from the forefront of village consciousness, though it had certainly not been forgotten. The human capacity for adaptation was remarkable, Miss Marple reflected. People adjusted to new realities with surprising speed, incorporating even the most dramatic upheavals into the ordinary fabric of their lives. The Ashford Hall had been sold to a family named Whitmore, who arrived from London with 3 children, an affable disposition, and a complete ignorance of the house's history. Within weeks, lights had been installed in the previously dark windows. The gardens had been put under the care of a professional groundskeeper, and the residence had begun to transform into something approaching a home rather than a monument to tragedy. David Garrett had established himself successfully in London, with Eleanor, their household management service, gaining a solid reputation among the middle and upper middle classes seeking reliable domestic assistance. They corresponded occasionally with the village, sending warm letters that suggested they had found not merely employment, but genuine partnership and purpose. Malcolm Ashford had disappeared from public view entirely, his name appearing only occasionally in financial notices regarding the settlement of his father's estate. The debts that had driven him to sabotage the angel had been cleared through careful management of the inheritance, and he had apparently chosen to live a quieter life, away from the scrutiny that continued to follow his name. It was on an October afternoon, as the leaves were beginning their transformation into autumn gold, that Miss Marple encountered Inspector Craddock at the market square. He had come to the village to conduct a follow-up investigation regarding a minor property theft, a matter of negligible importance, but had clearly taken the opportunity to revisit the scene of his most significant recent case. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, recognizing her immediately. "As always, Inspector," she replied. "I have been reflecting upon the case," Craddock said, gesturing toward the now ordinary market square, "upon the way you were able to perceive the truth when others saw only surface appearances." They sat on a bench near the fountain, the autumn air crisp around them, and Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Prevention," she said finally, "would have required a different set of choices at multiple junctures. If Lord Ashford had not developed his conscience regarding his financial misdeeds, if he had not decided to make restitution, there would have been no motivation for Lady Ashford's desperation. If Malcolm had not attempted his initial sabotage, if he had instead simply accepted that his inheritance would be reduced, there would have been no mechanism for murder. Yet each of these individuals made the choices they made," Craddock observed. "Precisely," Miss Marple agreed. "Lord Ashford chose conscience over continued complicity. Malcolm chose manipulation over acceptance. Lady Ashford chose violence over loss. And Reverend Thurston chose to trust rather than to verify. Each choice seemed reasonable to the person making it, given their understanding of the circumstances." Craddock asked. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment, her pale blue eyes observing the ordinary movements of the village. A woman carrying shopping, children playing near the fountain, a farmer driving his cart toward the market. "No," she said finally. "I believe Lady Ashford is a woman who constructed an identity entirely dependent upon external circumstances. When those circumstances threatened to change, she could not imagine adapting herself. She could only imagine the destruction of the identity she had built. And rather than face that destruction, she chose to destroy others." Craddock asked. "The lesson," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "is that we must be careful about constructing our identities entirely around external circumstances. Position, wealth, social standing, these things are temporary and fragile. They can be lost through circumstance entirely beyond our control." As autumn progressed toward winter, the village prepared once again for the Christmas season. The committee that organized the annual festival was somewhat hesitant about organizing another public celebration in the market square, but ultimately decided that to abandon the tradition entirely would be to allow the tragedy to permanently shadow the village's future. The decorations were simpler this year, less elaborate than they had been the previous Christmas. There was no angel. Consensus had been reached that perhaps a more modest focal point would be appropriate. Instead, the committee had commissioned a small nativity scene, constructed from wood and featuring figures of traditional religious significance. Miss Marple attended the opening of the festival, as she attended nearly all village events. She observed the decorations, the gathering crowds, the return of familiar patterns and traditions. Life had reasserted itself, gentle and persistent, gradually erasing the sharp edges of trauma. It was as she was examining the nativity scene that Mrs. Prothero approached, bearing the gift of new gossip as always. "You'll never guess," Mrs. Prothero began, which was her standard opening regardless of whether guessing was actually possible or desirable. "Lady Ashford, the imprisoned one I mean, has apparently become quite religious in her cell. She has requested permission to work in the prison chapel, to attend additional services." "How interesting," Miss Marple said mildly. "I'm not certain one can trust anything about such people," Mrs. Prothero said darkly. "Perhaps," Miss Marple acknowledged, "or perhaps her faith represents a genuine attempt to reconstruct her identity around something more substantial than social position and material wealth. We cannot know another person's heart with certainty, Mrs. Prothero." That evening, as the festival continued around her, Miss Marple sat on a bench in the gathering darkness, watching the lights of the nativity scene twinkle gently. She thought about Lady Ashford, imprisoned in a cell, attempting to rebuild herself through religious faith. She thought about Reverend Thurston, serving his sentence with apparent humility and seeking redemption through the remaining years of his life. She thought about Malcolm, struggling to reconstruct his financial situation and his damaged reputation. She thought about David and Elena, building new lives in London, attempting to move beyond the shadow of tragedy. And she thought about Lord Ashford himself, a man whose final acts had been driven by conscience, who had attempted to make amends for past wrongs, and who had paid for that conscience with his life. This was human nature in its full complexity. People were neither wholly evil nor wholly good. They were creatures of contradiction, capable of profound kindness and terrible cruelty, often simultaneously. They were driven by desires they did not fully understand, motivated by fears they could not articulate, constrained by circumstances they could not control. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, there was something redemptive in the attempt to understand these contradictions, to approach people with compassion even in the face of their worst actions. Understanding did not mean excusing, but it meant approaching human weakness with the recognition that weakness was a universal condition, that no person was so far removed from ordinary humanity that they could not be comprehended through careful observation and genuine thought. The Christmas season continued its approach. The village of St. Mary Mead, having survived scandal and tragedy, had reasserted its essential nature, a community of ordinary people engaged in the ordinary business of living, observing the customs and traditions that had been observed for generations, finding meaning and purpose in the rhythms of the seasons and the connections between neighbours. And Miss Marple, as she had always been, was present to observe it all, to see the patterns that others missed, to understand the hidden motivations that drove people toward their fates, and to maintain her quiet, compassionate observation of the endless human drama that unfolded in this small corner of England. The angel was gone. But life continued, and in that continuation lay all the lessons that mattered, that redemption was possible, that understanding was necessary, that compassion could coexist with justice, and that even in the darkest human actions, there could be found the seeds of meaning and transformation.